Governor, you're keeping monetary policy unchanged at this time. Are you worried about the weak data lately we've seen?
Well, on the one hand, data is a bit weaker than in the past, but on the other hand, one has to be mindful of the fact that the Swedish economy and the global economy has by now been very strong for a number of years. So from that perspective, there is enough demand pressure in the Swedish economy to keep monetary policy unchanged.
Yes, you're once again trimming the forecast for GDP, but you're also raising the inflation forecast slightly. Why is that?
Well, yeah, basically because times have been good for a long time. Unemployment is low. People are actually searching for people to employ. And that means that given that where we're coming from a little bit slower growth, it's not a major issue because aggregate demand is going to stay above average for the projection period that we're talking about here.
What are the biggest risks to the economy right now?
Well, for us, given that we're a small open economy, it's basically what happens around us. If that's Brexit, if it's what's going on within the Eurozone, trade issues and things like that.
But considering the developments, is the risk to the rate path on the downside?
It's too early. It's too early to tell because times have been good, as I've said, for a long time. We're still at minus 0.25, which in a historic perspective is very, very low. And while at the same time you have these kind of regional or global risks, and they're certainly on the downside. That is the case. But on the other hand, given that where we're coming from, they're sort of evening out.
We've seen the ECB and the Fed taking a more dovish turn lately. Can you really go through with your hiking plans if they decide not to?
Well, what really matters to us here is what happens in Europe, because if Europe is doing okay, then with the higher likelihood we will be doing okay as well. But it's important to keep in mind that there's not a one-to-one relationship between us and what the ECB is doing. We live next to an elephant, and when the elephant moves, it affects us. That's the case. But on the other hand, there's nothing automatic about that. So they certainly do what they think is best for the rest of Europe, and if they are successful doing their thing, that certainly will make things easier for us.
Can you tell us about the QE reinvestment plans? Were they up for discussion?
No, they were not really up for discussion this time because the plans have been set now for end June. And that means that we will get back to this issue in April. So this time around it was completely a non-issue because what we have said in the past stays, and we'll get back to it in April.
What's your view on the continued weakness of the krona that we've seen this year? Well,
with a floating exchange rate, sometimes the krona goes down, sometimes it goes up. So in the last few days, the krona has depreciated a bit, but that certainly has not been a major issue when we have discussed monetary policy.
You also decided not to extend the mandate to do quick interventions in the currency market. Don't you see a need for that anymore?
No, not really, because that mandate was put in place when inflation was much lower and below our inflation target of 2%, and at the same time inflationary expectations were also low, so it was a quite dangerous situation for us given where we were back then. And now when inflation is around 2%, unemployment is low, the Swedish economy is doing okay, then in that environment there is no need for that mandate presently.
How weak could the krona be without causing a problem to the economy?
There are all sorts of views on that. But given that we have a floating exchange rate, we're far from an exchange rate at that level.
About the e-krona that you're thinking of introducing, other authorities like the FSA and the National Debt Office have said that the e-krona should be investigated thoroughly by the government or parliament. Are you going to? Well,
it's clear in this country that the general public adapts and is ready to use new technologies very quickly, and that means that we're very rapidly in this country moving out of cash. So cash is on the verge of becoming more or less irrelevant. That means that the structure of the financial sector and us issuing notes and coins is changing and changing rapidly, and based on that, it's up to us to think about then what's next. that is an issue that will take a few years to sort out. One issue is to deal with the technical aspects of this, because one can potentially introduce an e-krona in many different ways. But at the same time, there is another issue which is just as important and maybe even more important, and that is to define in a legal sense what we mean using the concept legal tender when physical cash is more or less irrelevant. And that certainly will take an act of Parliament to decide what that is. And thinking about this and the way people were discussing in the late 1800s, that was when the Riksbank was given the sole right to issue notes and coins. That was discussed back then for a long, long time. And then people settled on the present structure of the system. Now when technology changes, the old structure is disappearing, and then it's our responsibility, at least in my view, to think about where to go next.
So it's up to the Parliament?
Ultimately, at the end of the day, because we are an authority under Parliament, and they have the right to produce laws in this country, and this issue certainly forces us to deal with the issue of how do we define legal tender in a digital world. And there, from that perspective, we're maybe ahead of some other countries. So it will certainly require some kind of legislative act.